Hello and welcome to the 8th episode of Chicago Dialogues. I am Deepesh Chakrabarty. I teach history and South Asian languages and civilizations at the University of Chicago, and I currently serve as the faculty director of the University of Chicago Center in Delhi. This series, as you know, is being produced by the University of Chicago Center in Delhi in collaboration with proher.in. And we are very fortunate to have the multi-talented and the best-selling author, Avik Chanda, as the anchor and the curator of this series. Today's series features two of my very esteemed colleagues, Wendy Doniger and Gary Tubb, in conversation. It's Wendy Doniger in conversation with Gary Tubb and Avik Chanda, talking about Wendy's time as a young scholar in India, in Bengal, in Shantiniketan, in the 1960s. And I myself was so interested to see those old photographs of Wendy back in those years. So Avik will formally introduce Wendy Doniger and Gary Tubb. Welcome to the show. Enjoy it. Over to you, Avik.
Thank you so much, Deepesh, and a very warm welcome, big welcome to all our viewers across the world. And today's episode is called Wendy Doniger in Bengal, Letters from 1963. Now, as the title suggests, it's all about her, Wendy Doniger. And although she needs absolutely no introduction, purely as a matter of protocol, she's the Mecha Aliade Distinguished Service Professor Emerita of the History of Religions, also in the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations, the Committee on Social Thought, and the college. On the face of it, I mean, if you go by her website on the university page, her research and her teaching interests over the years have revolved around two principal areas, Hinduism and mythology. But as more than 40 of her books, written over 50 years, prove, her range of expertise lies across a dazzling spectrum, really, where dreams and death, evil, masquerade, gods and animals of all denominations feature in the keen observation of history, mythology, literature, law, gender, zoology, the fine arts, music, dance, and film. So essentially making her the Renaissance woman, if you will, of our times. But today, we're not here to discuss any of her previous books, but a fascinating new work in progress that's being undertaken by Wendy. And to lead us through this discussion, we're extremely privileged to have with us Professor Gary Tubb, who is the Anupama and Guru Ramakrishnan Professor and Chair of the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. His research interests and publications include Sanskrit language and literature, Indian philosophy, and the history of Sanskrit linguistic and literary theory. Wendy, Gary, very good morning to you and a very warm welcome to Chicago Dialogues.
Thank you, Avik. Wendy, I'd like to start off with something about the background locations. During your first trip to India, and in the letters that you sent home, you described two places. First, the bucolic surroundings of Tagore's Shantiniketan, and then the home of a formidable American professor of Bengali, right in the city of Calcutta. And these two places might seem to have almost been designed to isolate you from more typical parts of India. And yet, both of these atmospheres that you encountered, that of peaceful nature in the countryside of Bengal and the vibrant urban culture of Calcutta, both of them are in themselves important features of Indian life. So I wonder if you could say something looking back on that first year about how you now assess the value of those experiences.
Oh, a good question, Gary. I guess living and traveling in India brought to life all the stories I'd been reading in the Puranas and the Kavyas and the Mahabharata. And I discovered that forests in India were not like the oak forests I imagined, but they were really like jungles. And I saw what the tops of palaces looked like, where people are always going up on tops of palaces in Indian poetry. Um, and I also saw what the gods looked like from all the statues. And experiencing the heavy, solid sheets of rain during the monsoon and the intensity of the heat, just sort of being there, it made it possible for me forever after to imagine myself inside the stories that I read in Sanskrit, the places and the sorts of people and the landscapes and the houses and the skies. Whenever I went back inside a text, I could imagine myself being there. It made a tremendous difference.
Right. Wendy, Gary talked about exposures, but there was also an exposure of a different kind, perhaps something that you weren't really prepared for. And that was possibly the sheer scale and ubiquity of the poverty that you saw on the streets of Calcutta, right? I mean, given that you're as a very young American from an affluent family, how did that all strike you? And how were those first impressions reflected in the letters back home?
So it was a shock. I was a spoiled brat. I had really was unprepared for India in all sorts of ways. I had hardly even ever been in an American slum, let alone a Calcutta slum. So my eyes were open to all sorts of things besides India on that first trip. But after I got over the shock, I found ways, I think perhaps self-deceptive ways, survival ways, to live with the constant awareness of poverty, both in the countryside and in the city. Is this a moment to read a bit from what I wrote at that time when I was 22 years old? So here's what I wrote. Mind you, these are letters to my parents. Dear Mommy and Daddy, they all begin. The people do live in the street, but they're dressed in clean saris and dhotis, washing and shaving and telling jokes. And I guess I subconsciously feel that when the man lying down on the sidewalk wakes up, he will get up and walk home. At any rate, it's not as pitiful as what one might expect, as it lacks the squalor of American slums. The children in the street are completely spoiled by their parents, who manage to deny them nothing, no matter how dire their poverty. Everywhere on the street, you see children wearing nothing but a string under the tummy, following you curiously with their eyes, while their heads are held motionless by their mothers, who are popping little things to eat into their mouths. That's my experience of poverty on the streets of Calcutta.
Well, another question about those first experiences. The letters begin with experiences of India that you had at a time when you had already done some study of India in college, but you arrived in the country with many naive opinions and also some new opportunities to learn beyond the books. And now more than half a century has passed. And throughout all this time, you've continued to study India through books and in other ways as well. And yet, at the time that you went to India, you may have been a spoiled brat, but you'd already shown the potential to go in any number of illustrious directions. So I'm wondering what sorts of things happened during that first year that ensured the persistence of your interest in India. And among the things that you learned there, what things have continued to be useful to you in all this time?
Well, you're right, of course. I'd already read about India and fallen in love with it from what I'd read. I loved the excesses of all kinds. It suited my personality. I loved the bright colors that the women wore. I loved the spicy food. I loved eating with my fingers. I'd always wanted to eat with my fingers, and at last it was okay to do that. I loved the art. I loved the way it packed so many images into a painting or a sculpture in contrast with the starkness of Europe. But when I actually got to India, I learned to love other things. I developed in particular a passion for the landscape, for the individual people, and I love the animals in India. I love the gentle crows and the enormous snakes and the cunning lizards and the birds with their strange songs. And I developed a love for the culture, and particularly the culture of the countryside in Bolpur and Shantiniketan. The little boys driving the cows home at sunset, stirring up the cow dust, just like the stories I'd read and went on reading. And that infusion of a sense of the life of India was something I never had from enjoying the paintings and the sculptures and the text I'd read before. That was what changed.
Right. Just a quick aside for our viewers. The letters from 1963 are still very much a work in progress, and it's a matter of great privilege for me personally, and Gary is part of that fortunate group, and so is Dipesh Dao. We are amongst the first people in the world to have read the manuscript and then reread it end to end, and then have had the opportunity to discuss with Wendy our individual sort of favorite passages. And I can tell you what mine are. They're really the ones where you describe the quotidian on the face of it, the ephemeral. You're talking about a fleeting landscape.
Yeah.
As you're passing by of the railways, or just the quality of light, the moonlight in Shantiniketan, or indeed your first impressions, first time that you went to visit the Agra fort. And I think it'll be an absolute treat for our viewers if you were to read some excerpts from these.
Nothing pleases an author more than to be invited to read from what she's writing. So the book is in progress. Eventually, it'll be published by Ravi Singh, Speaking Tiger, as all my Indian books are. But now I'm working on it, and I'm grateful for the feedback I've had from Avik and Gary and others. So here's a couple of passages. Last night was full moon, and everyone wore white and walked across the meadows singing a lovely Tagore song about the moon. I've never seen such moonlight. You could easily read by it, and it was difficult to look right at the moon for any length of time. The monsoon clouds swept by it very swiftly, looking starched and solid in the bright, cool light. And the moon was so bright that it cut right through the clouds so that it looked as if they kept parting before it. And then there was a beautiful halo around it, even when there were no clouds, and thousands of stars, the dimmest of them brighter than Venus is at home. It's funny, in spite of all the really foreign and fascinating things here, I am still most interested in and moved by the things I love best at home, the sky and the children and the trees. Some of this, paradoxically, is due to the feeling of Shantiniketan itself, which is so tied up in nature. The temple services are held outdoors, and you can see the squirrels and monkeys fighting, and the crows stealing things, and the birds shaking drops of water off the flowering trees, while you hear the old poem about the spirit that dwells in the leaves and in the waters, and about the sanctity of all life. So that's the countryside. Then there's another passage about viewing the countryside from a train. I left for Calcutta, a crazy train ride. The third class carriage was so full I had to get in through the window, but a most beautiful one. The scenery from the train had that magical light upon it, misty and super sharp. In the distance, all was purple and infinitely far away. Nearer, the glorious paddy fields stretching for miles like another green sky beneath the dimmer blue one. And in the foreground, single figures with a compelling mythological simplicity, a boy running behind a calf. Here, a thatched hut or a tent of coconut leaves is like a tree or an animal's home. They do not challenge nature with strange materials and awkward shapes. And so their sweet, vague houses blend in with the land, making the deserted places alive and the inhabited places peaceful. A palm tree rising curved out of a sea of paddy, alone, asserting itself, sticking out its chest. A heron mirrored in a pool looking very aesthetic, or flying low over the fields, casting a dazzling, sharp shadow, looking very holy, as if he'd just flown out of the heart of some dying saint. or just perched on the head of a bullock submerged in the paddy fields, looking very funny. The whole scene captured the essence of mythology. Each figure was the only thing that existed, and each was not merely itself, but all the things it stood for. Even the ugly things became beautiful as they flickered between art and life. The intricate twisting of the trunk and roots of an ancient banyan tree, like an aged man. A pile of bricks where someone had foolishly tried to build a house that would last longer than the others. So those are the country landscapes. Do you want me to read the bit about, we talked about the fort at Agra, which is a different story.
Wendy, I'm going to be very greedy.
Yep.
There's also the one on page 16, and if you have that, it'll be great, because that also had to do with light and nature and the quality of light in Bengal. If you have that.
I thought I had too much. You can read it though, if you like. Have you got it?
All right, maybe I take that out. And in the meantime, we can talk about the Agra fort. Yes.
Let me tell you about the fort at Agra. I thought it was just too much. Okay, so here's the fort at Agra. Then we saw the fort at Agra. It seemed like such a brutal thing, and it was such an amazing revelation for me to go inside and to sense on a personal level what it was that made them fight so fiercely to retain it. Inside the fort was the most beautiful, delicate, lively green miniature city, a full life. First, the steep stone hill where the horses galloped home, and above it, the palaces where the women must have stood to see if their husbands had come home alive this time. Then at the top of the hill, a green field with shade trees and wells, and a quiet white mosque above it, and places where the goats and sheep used to graze and the children played. I think the men standing at the narrow slits of the fortress walls must have been able to smell the cooking of the women in the palaces behind them, and perhaps heard their children's voices shouting at play as they shot their long bows at the attacking enemy, and the sound of the women praying for them in the mosque only a few hundred feet above them on the hill. I could see windows in the palaces that looked out upon the moat below, and I could really understand how those soldiers would fight to the death when they had their whole life right there behind them put to the sword. So that's my imagination of the Agra fort.
That's really amazing. And in fact, Gary and I were talking about the other day, right? Whether these are really flights of fancy and flights of imagination, or whether there is some historical underpinning to it. And I've done a little bit of reading around the Agra fort and the Mughal history. And what I do know is perhaps it's not specific, this particular experience or this particular imagination, to the Agra fort, but there are many other forts.
Yes.
One of the fort in Lal Killa, and particularly the forts in Rajasthan and the forts in Northwest Frontier province. And there is this beautiful passage by Gulbadan Begum, who wrote the Humayun Nama, who does say exactly that she would see the menfolk, she would see Babur, her father, and later, when Babur was dead, her less efficient, less militarily astute Humayun ride out to battle, and she would see that from the tenements. It's amazing. He says that.
I'd love to see that passage. I'd love to put it in as a footnote. I'd love to. You have to give me.
I will absolutely send that to you.
Please do.
I'm going to still look for page 16, but in the meantime, Gary, over to you.
Yes, well, I'm glad that Avik has asked Wendy to read some of those passages, partly because they were some of my favorite passages too, and they'll give people a sense of what the letters are like. And that's important, partly because I should have said more at the very beginning to explain what's in the book and how it came to be during a research trip that Wendy took on a grant. But I think you've heard enough from the excerpts to figure most of this out, that they were letters that she sent home to her mother and father, which means that they're not entirely honest. She left out things that might have worried them. But there are some passages in the letters which are so intense that I'm sure they have a real authenticity. One of my favorites is the segment in the letters that deals with the time, Wendy, when you were fortunate enough to be in the company of the great Sarod master Ali Akbar Khan. And you describe eloquently not only his own attitudes and his skill, but the differences in personality and in style that you observed between him and his brother-in-law, Ravi Shankar, at a time when the two were often performing together.
Yes.
And I know that before your trip to India, you yourself had been taught by some great musical artists in America, especially in the world of classical dance. So I wonder, were any of the things that you found most striking in Ali Akbar Khan similar to what you'd seen in these other masters, or do you feel that every musical genius is largely unique?
Well, they're all unique. Yes, you're right. I think I knew from studying ballet with George Balanchine, I knew how to recognize genius when I stumbled on it, and I certainly recognized it in the music that Ali Akbar played. But Balanchine projected his own strong sense of being a genius in the way he looked at you and spoke and gestured. He was the great man. While Ali Akbar just seemed like an ordinary slob until he picked up his charade. And it was quite a contrast. So it's a rather long passage, but it talks, but it was a long, he played for a long time. Let me just say that. So it's a long passage. So this is to my parents. I didn't tell them, it's just to my parents. Night after night, I've been going to the concerts of Ravi Shankar and Ali Akbar Khan, very beautiful and moving music. The two men are strikingly different, though they are good friends, brothers-in-law, and embrace warmly backstage after each concert. Ravi Shankar is very fiery and temperamental, showing off, wearing fancy shirts, making the sitar look as difficult as possible, speaking French to his admiring retinue. Ali Akbar sits like a Buddha, half asleep all the time, and strokes the sarod casually as if he were stroking a sleeping cat. Last night, Ali Akbar played without Ravi Shankar. He sat cross-legged on a Persian rug, wearing white pajamas and a little gray vest, and he tuned his charod. The charod is a far richer and more versatile instrument than the sitar. The sitar is like Chianti, but the charod is like champagne. You slide a charod rather than finger it, and if you're Ali Akbar, you can do the most marvelous things with it. Try to imagine Segovia, Oistrakh, Dave Brubeck, and Earl Scruggs all rolled into one, and that's just the beginning. He played for 8 hours, all night, and the whole thing was improvisation on a raga. At first, he played without the tabla, and he played slowly and sadly, keeping a steady rhythm with the strumming hand, but somehow managing to produce a legato melody by sliding along the strings. It was like wind on water or an animal crying out, sometimes like the ocean or like keening. There was no question of understanding complex rhythmic patterns or note systems. It was pure emotion, immediately intelligible and moving. I'd wondered when I first heard of it how anyone could listen to music all night, but I understood now. Though the rhythm continues steadily, there's no pattern of long duration in the melody, but the momentary patterns of an inspiration. He sits with his head down, strumming, with his fingering hand relaxed on his leg, and suddenly he'll reach out and caress the instrument for a few notes, and let his hand drop back, and then reach out and dart up and down in a terrifically intricate run, sounding like birds fighting. And again, the hand relaxes, and it's like a conversation, each spurt entirely different and clearly marked with an emotion, even subtle emotions like disgust and impatience, as well as the more forceful moments of grief or love or anger. And you simply hold your breath during the steady strumming, wondering what he will say to you next. Sometimes he would pluck a string hard once, and then without striking it again, he'd play an entire tune by sliding up and down on it, slow and then quick and then slow motion until the sound died out. There was an infinite variety in it, and he played like this unaccompanied for about 3 hours. And all the time in the room spread with white cloths on the floor, with everyone sitting cross-legged, people kept moving in the rhythm, but there was not a sound except when sometimes he'd play an unbearably beautiful melody, or in the faster part later on, play simply more and more and more until you couldn't believe it. And when he finished the run, there would be a gasp or a cry of approval, almost like an ole, and he would smile at us and then look down again and wait for a new mood, sometimes moving his fingers over the strings without actually touching them, as he waited to pluck a new rhythm or melody out of the air. The room grew warm, and he took off his vest and mopped his bald head from time to time with his left hand, still keeping up the strumming with his right. The strings would go out of tune, and he'd tighten them, still plucking out a melody on the string, tightening it in short spurts, so that he played a melody on the string he was tightening all the time he was tightening it. After a while, there was a break. We ate dinner, and then the second part began with the tabla. It was marvelous. They kept the same basic rhythm, but the tabla would play variations in the rhythm, while the sarod played variations on the raga, sometimes in the same rhythmic variation as the tabla, sometimes different. They would joke and fight, as Ali Akbar later described it to me. The tabla can play melodies by striking different parts of the two drums, and of course, the sarod can play complex rhythms by the strum, and they would imitate one another and pick up one another's variations. And sometimes they would look at each other and smile and finish off a long run with a loud, fast, perfectly together coda, and everyone would laugh with delight. It was like a Dixieland jam session in spirit, but with an Elizabethan elegance and an Indian sweetness. Sometimes the sarod would be very mournful, but the tabla very excited beneath it. Sometimes the tabla would beat out a steady funereal rhythm, while the sarod went all crazy with little runs. And sometimes they would play in the same mood. It was altogether the most wonderful music I've ever heard.
Wonderful.
It was
Absolutely.
wonderful. It was wonderful 50 years ago, 60 years ago. I can still remember it.
Fascinating. Wendy, let me go back, and I'd like to take a cue from what Gary mentioned earlier, in particular about classical dance, right? What very few of our viewers know is that when you were in your teens, you were studying very seriously to be a dancer.
Yes.
And of course, one of your teachers at that time was the legendary Martha Graham. But of course, you gave all that up when you decided to become a Sanskrit scholar. Right? And yet, just a few years later, maybe 5 or 6 years later, when you came down to India to study Sanskrit, you found yourself drawn once again to Indian forms of classical dance, to Bharatnatyam, for instance, to Manipuri dance. And then you began to take lessons in earnest. So please share with us your experience of those.
I was very fortunate. I went to South India. I met Bala Saraswati and had several wonderful conversations with the greatest of all Bharatnatyam dancers. But I didn't study Bharatnatyam myself. I studied Manipuri, and I did that up in Shantiniketan. And this is what I wrote to my parents about that. I've begun my dance classes here. Manipuri dance is a lovely kind of dancing, and although my hands don't bend backwards, I find that grace and balance and control are the pillars of Manipuri dance as they were of ballet and modern dance. The big studio, the strict dance master who even carries a little bamboo stick with which he emphasizes your mistakes, the pleasant feeling of being hot and wet clear through the 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. All of it conspires to make me feel like the old days again. So that was my dance experience in India.
I have another question, which I feel I should ask as a fellow Sanskritist, Wendy. You've spent a lifetime, actually, you've spent most of your lifetime so far working with Sanskrit texts and with what we can learn from them. And as you know, many scholars have noted that in the older classical Sanskrit texts, there are very few examples of personal biography or autobiography.
It's true.
While you in your own life have known over the years many fascinating Indians with quite distinctive personalities, beginning with some of those that are described in passages you just read for us. So I'm wondering if you felt any kind of disconnect between the impact of those encounters and the prevailingly stereotypical nature of classical Sanskrit texts, or whether these things have interacted in some constructive way in your own thought over the years.
Yeah. Well, yes, indeed. I did indeed have the very good luck to meet a number of amazing people during that year in India, many of whom remained friends all the rest of my life. And some of the most remarkable were not the famous ones like Ali Akbar Khan, or even the Tagores, whom I met when I was at Shantiniketan. But some of the young women at Shantiniketan, and particularly two who became my friends and about whom I wrote quite a lot in the letters home, particularly the brilliant Mishtuni Roy, whom I later knew in England until she died, and my hot-tempered Punjabi friend Chanchal, about whom there's a lot in the letters. And in my later work as a scholar, I found that I could read these strong personalities into the equally strong personalities, not of the authors of Sanskrit texts, as you say, Gary, we know so little about them, but into the personalities of the fictional characters who then became very real to me. The spunkiness of Shakuntala, more in the Mahabharata version than in Kalidasa's poem about her. The courage of Parvati in both the Puranas and the folk tellings when she talks back to her husband, and going back even to Gargi in the Upanishads, who holds her own among all those male scholars. I knew those women, and I could imagine their gestures and their facial expressions by remembering the spirited women that I met at Shantiniketan. So that did make a big difference in the way I read the text for the rest of my life.
Thanks.
Wendy, I think I've finally found page
Okay.
16, and it's really, really beautiful. So I don't want to let it go to pass. So obviously, I'm not going to be able to read it as well as you
Oh, I'm
remotely.
sure you'll read it.
But I'll just try and read at least just a few lines, because this is beautiful. This again goes back possibly to the first few weeks in Bengal, and particularly you've gone from Calcutta to Shantiniketan, to the countryside, right? And there's this passage where you just described the light of the countryside in Bengal. And here's how it goes. I think I know one of the reasons why everything in Bengal looks so magnificently beautiful.
Oh,
There is something unique and queer about the light. To begin with, everything is green. It's different shades of green, ranging from forest green, in the forests, of course, to a bright goldy green that I've never seen anywhere else. And the air is warm and moist, so that everything looks very far away and blurry and sort of storybookish, something like the backgrounds in Renaissance portraits. And it is so completely flat that there's really just one low horizon. This is the background. And then in this hazy, flat, hypnotic green, objects appear in the foreground, highlighted by a sudden shaft of light that breaks through the clouds and silhouetted against the flat horizon, and the only color other than green. And the total effect is such that the object in the foreground leaps out at you like the figures in the 3D lens sphere, or the glowing images that appear when a figure is superimposed in color movies, or a figure spotted on a dim stage. And so your eyes are fascinated by whatever you're looking at, a flower or a cow or a tree, and it looks magical and very precious, like the single vase in a Japanese room. Perhaps this is what gave such a magical aura to the line of dancing boys I saw last week. The objects in the landscape seem to be in another dimension. Their details are terribly sharp, surprisingly sharp, like the things you suddenly see through field glasses, all the more so because of the exquisite softness of the background landscape, which looks as if it were photographed through gaze. you really expect them to disappear the minute you turn away, like Pindar's description of the Greek countryside. Here, there are more gods than men. I thought that was absolutely fascinating.
It's very nice to hear somebody else read it. I think you read it better than I do. Thank
No, certainly not.
I had never heard it read before. Thank you.
So now what we're going to do is Dipeshda has been waiting backstage, so to speak, very patiently, and he has a few questions, and we have a little treat for our viewers, and then we go into Q&A with the live audience. So what I would request is that we get back Dipeshda on screen.
There he is.
I have to unmute myself. Yeah.
Yes.
No, this is wonderful. Wendy, I was wondering whether, I mean, like as a young person there and coming into contact with Indian scholars, did you see differences between cultures of scholarship, like the cultures of scholarship you came from and cultures of scholarship there, what you saw in India?
Oh, certainly. At Shantiniketan in particular, Shantiniketan at that time was more like a finishing school for upper-class Bengali girls. So there was a great deal of,
Right.
of painting.
And not just Bengali girls.
So that
Mrs. Gandhi went there. Mrs. Gandhi went there to finish her education. Yeah.
Defense rests. I rest my case. So there was that kind of culture where everyone was always painting and singing Tagore songs and so forth. In Calcutta, where I was privileged to work with one of the great pundits, Rajendra Chandra Hajra, I came across a very different kind of scholarship, which began with the complete memorization of all the texts. So I wanted to talk about a Vedic text, I had to get a book out and find it. If he wanted to talk about a Vedic text, he just picked it out of the air into his head and said so. So I learned that that Indian scholars, and not even great scholars, I was staying with the Dimmicks, Ed Dimmick, who was the head of the American Institute of Indian Studies, and I met all sorts of wonderful intellectuals in Calcutta. And I met a man, we went to his house, he had 8,000 books in his house, and he said he knew what was in every one of them. And Ed picked up one book off a shelf and read the first word, and the man read the entire, he knew it all by heart. He said it by heart. He said he knew Shakuntala, Kalidasa's play, and he recited the entire play for me in 45 minutes. So there was a kind of internalization of the text in India, which was very impressive to me, and which became a different kind of understanding. I could never mimic myself. I could never memorize all they memorized, but I memorized a lot more.
Yeah. I mean, I've actually heard of the great Professor Dinesh Chandra Sarkar of archaeology, that he knew all the volumes of Epigraphica Indica by heart.
Yes, absolutely. Back in Chicago on the Committee on Social Thought, I met David Green, and he knew all of Greek classical literature by heart. But there isn't that much of Greek classical literature, really. That's not such a big deal. To know Sanskrit literature by heart is a much more impressive deal. So I did learn what it meant to know that it's internal.
I mean, I remember at Presidency College, a professor who lectured without any notes, but lectured coherently.
Yeah.
And was always valued for that prowess, the capacity to do this. And I think it must have been this old tradition which came into even the teaching of physics. And
there was the respect that everyone in India had for Sanskrit, especially, oh, you know Sanskrit, they would say. When I went to the bank, if I was having trouble getting a check, oh, you know Sanskrit. Suddenly, when I was in Benares, I was staying at Clark's Hotel, which is the old colonial hotel. And I was labeled some kind of a tourist. So when I went into, because that was where they all stayed. So when I went into an art shop to buy a painting, they showed me the modern copies that were no good. And I couldn't get to see. So I turned one over once and it had an inscription in Sanskrit on the back. And I read it out loud. And the owner of the shop said, "Oh, you know Sanskrit?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Oh," he said, bring tea. So they brought and they started showing me the real old paintings that I was really interested in. There was such respect for anyone who knew Sanskrit. So that was a great thing.
Yeah, and that probably is still true.
And Wendy, talking about painting, we haven't included it, but it's definitely there in the letters. You met the great Jamini Roy,
Oh,
and you
yes.
bought a painting from him, an original painting, no less, for like $30. Talk to us about that experience of meeting Jamini
Uh,
Roy.
it was wonderful to meet Jamini Roy. He lived just down the street from us in Ballygunge. He was old then, and he wasn't nearly as famous as he was to become. And in particular, he felt that Indians did not value their own tradition. That is to say, the sort of Indians who were interested in modern painting, Picasso and all of that. And he would paint deceptively simple themes of Krishna or Ganesha or a woman, the famous painting of the woman in a sari. And he wasn't really appreciated by his own people in trying to make Indian themes part of the world of modern art. I bought several paintings from him. I still have several. We talked a lot about the way that only scholars were interested in the old Indian, and a kind of Orientalist scholar at that, the British, who loved everything old in India, nothing new in India. Um, a habit which I myself picked up also, I may say, looking for the ancient ruins and so forth. But he was trying to bring into modern Indian painting that same sense of the countryside and of the lines of a woman's head and everything that were characteristic of Indian art all through, but in particular of folk painting.
Mhm.
And a lot of his contemporaries mistook him for just a folk painter. And at that period, he was still not valued. It was very strange to talk to what was obviously a very great painter who wasn't treated like a great painter, and was a very interesting man. And I had many wonderful conversations with him. I liked him very much.
Gary was earlier mentioning that given that these letters were all written to your parents, there was a good deal of editing and a good deal of censoring on that.
Yes.
However, there are hints of adventures even in the letters themselves. For example, when you go with Miss Tuni Roy to her relative's place in Mathura, and there's this description of the two of you going along the by lanes wearing a sari on a bicycle.
That's
And then there are, of course, others which were probably expunged from the letters, but which you talk about in the introduction, where you're sleeping in the third class compartment, the waiting room
the
in the
ladies.
railway station,
I
the
traveled
ladies'
all.
room.
I traveled all over India by train, all by myself. A lot, sometimes with Miss Tuni Roy, so she came on some of the trips, and we slept in the third class ladies' waiting room. If you had valuables or your passport or anything, you wrapped it up in a sari and you used that as a pillow under your head. And there was a chowkidar looking after you. And the trains all left at 3 or 4 in the morning for reasons best known to them. So you had to be in the station all night anyway. And I didn't stay in hotels much at all. I mainly slept in the rail. I did not tell my parents about that. I didn't tell them also of a wonderful time when I was traveling from Delhi back to Calcutta, and I was staying at the home of Gordon Fairbanks. He was the head of the Ford Foundation. And his daughter, who was like 17, had never been allowed out of the house. She'd never gone anywhere. And she was so envious of me traveling all over India. So he agreed rather nervously to allow her to travel with me back to Calcutta and bought us a first class sleeping car because it was his daughter. Normally I went third class. When we got to the station, it was one of those cars they have in India where there's no corridor, there's just a door to the station so that when the train is in motion, no one can get into the car because there's no corridor. And there were 4 berths, and already in the berth were 2 great, big, juicy-looking Sikh gentlemen in their pajamas. And Mr. Fairbanks had to shut me and his innocent little daughter into this car. There was a moment of great hesitation until he got into conversation with them, and it turned out they were gentlemen. He knew people they knew. They exchanged cards, business cards together, and with less misgivings, he locked us into this sleeping car with the 2 Sikhs, and we traveled safely, I may say, all the way to Calcutta. So I didn't put all that stuff into the letters with to my parents.
No, I think you gave the general impression to your parents that you were quite lucky throughout. And there are some really interesting little passages where you do seem to have special supportive nature. There's very amusing little vignette early on where when you were caught in for the one of the first times in a heavy rain, the rain washed the dye out of your shoes and turned your feet red, and you were struck by how Indian women have to go to some trouble to arrange to have someone paint their feet red, and nature had done it for you with no trouble at all.
I had ready-made dye on my feet. I had wonderful luck all through India, and I had the luck also of having conversations with strangers in these third-class carriages and travels, where I met people who taught me songs and listened to my songs. We exchanged poetry. At one point, I was traveling from Shantiniketan down to Calcutta, and I had forgotten. I had nothing to eat, and it was the longest trip. And at some point, the man traveling with me said, "Aren't you going to eat?" And I said, "I actually had bought some bananas at Shantiniketan, but I left them there by mistake." And he jumped off the train and bought some bananas and said, "Because you left your bananas in Shantiniketan," and presented me with bananas to eat on the rest of the trip. And I met kind and friendly people like that all along the way, who wanted to talk about poetry and literature and Tagore songs. Everyone always wanted to talk about Tagore songs. I met Ed Dimmick on the plane. I didn't even know it. I was flying from London to Calcutta. There's a man there with 5 small children on a long flight. He was obviously going through hell. And my heart went out to him. And I spoke to him. And we got to talking, and it was Ed Dimmick who was the head of the AIIS in India, and he was going to be my host. And on a flight to Kathmandu at the end of the trip, I was seated next to an elderly lady. It was a rough flight. We got to talking, and it turned out to be Penelope Betjeman, who turned out to be one of the most important people in my life for the rest of my life. I knew her in England. She taught me to ride horses, and I picked them both up at 30,000 feet above India. So there were, the fates were very kind to me during that year. I was very lucky.
And the mention of Penelope and horses allows us to mention that the last book, which you actually finished and have coming out, I think it's already out in America and will be coming out in India at a date that Avik knows well, is about horses, the history of horses in
so
India.
We now have Troutman on elephants and Doniger on horses.
Horses.
That's right.
And I really I learned about India and horses at the same time, because I met Penelope Betjeman in India, and she was the one who taught me to ride and taught me to love horses. So there are all sorts of lucky things that happened during that year. The people I met, places I went. We went to Khajuraho, and it was entirely deserted. And it was very hard to get to in the 60s. You had to take a lot of trains and change trains, and the train times didn't meet at the same time. And so it was just that you walked across the landscape, this Rajasthan, this middle Indian countryside, and there were the Khajuraho temples. You said, "Oh, this is interesting. I wonder what that is." So there was a kind of innocence about it also, which was quite lovely. Also,
Wendy, did you get a chance to? I mean, you were young, but did you get a chance to think about the relationship between art and life in India? Because I mean, just think of the Jamini Roy's house. Because normally, I mean, sometimes I find art portrays a beautiful India, and you don't always see that around you. You know, so do you see? I was thinking, people would describe Kashi as a beautiful city, but when you go, it doesn't. I mean, there are obviously there's a beauty to Kashi. I'm not disputing that, but not everything seems beautiful. Do you think you can make a separation between art and life, or do you think they have another way of thinking about it? Or
there's two different. When I think about the way of Kashi and of cities and the way that buildings are. My friend Chanchal, my wonderful Punjabi friend, when I mentioned I was going to Kashi, to Benares, she said it's a wicked city. I said, no, it's a holy city. It's a holy city. She said, because it's a holy city, it's a wicked city. People think they can do whatever they want and then bathe in the Ganges.
Right.
Her opinion of the holiness of Benares. What about art and life? In a way, I could say something about architecture and life, which was that what I loved about the temples of Bhubaneswara in particular, and to some extent Khajuraho, and to some extent Indian temples altogether,
Yeah.
in contrast with the beauty of Mughal architecture. So the Mughal architecture was marble, it was light, it was perfect, it was celestial, it was as if a cloud had come down to settle on the earth. Whereas the Indian architecture, you would walk along the countryside in Bhubaneswar and you weren't sure whether that was a tree or a mountain. And as you got closer, it was a temple. It erupted out of the soil. It was made of the soil. It wasn't made of imported marble. And there was a feeling, not only in the caves, of course, which really are part, or in particular, the wonderful downward carved cave to Shiva near the Ajanta caves, where the cave is actually cut down into the ground. So when you're on the bottom of the temple, you look up, and the top of the temple is at earth level. That's the extreme example of the temple that comes out of the landscape. I love that about Indian architecture, how it grew out of the land. And much as I admired the Mughal monuments, I felt that they were perched uneasily on top of it in a way which wasn't as good. As for art and life, in a way, that was what I was coming to terms with the poverty that Gary mentioned it. I came back to it again and again in the levels, how it was that people who had so little were able to find beauty in their lives, how there was always the decoration of the poorest house and of the children in particular who had no toys, but they were cared for. There was a way of making little tiny things that you did have precious, small things, the few things you had, using art in that sense to paint beautiful horses on the sides of houses in the countryside in Bolpur. That was an ugly house. It was a nothing house, a piece of mud that had been dried in the sun, but they painted a horse on it. And a Rajasthani farmer had nothing but a bullock or two, but the bullock's horns, again, were painted beautifully and decorated with bells and things. So there were ways where poor people brought art into their life in a way which, in my very, very limited knowledge of poverty in America, I had never seen. For me, poverty in America was simply squalor. They didn't have what the rich people had, and they were very unhappy. That was what I thought about poor people. But poor people in India had something else which kept them going and kept them dignified. I don't know if I could say they were happy. I didn't know them well enough to know whether they're happy, but they were at least dignified, and they were at least living a life that had beauty in it, even under more easily done in the countryside than in the city, but also done in the city sometime too.
And that was something, Wendy, as you know, that I think we both heard repeatedly from our Sanskrit teacher at Harvard, Daniel Ingalls, who wrote about that being a feature of Bengal in particular. He said it was no little glory of Bengal, that not just in modern times, but in older Sanskrit literature, that with all the problems that they faced, and he was talking not just about poverty, but about cyclones and all sorts of other difficulties.
Monsoons,
it was so impressive that they had maintained such an energetic culture of engagement with the life around them. He felt that strongly when he went there, and I think you did too.
I did indeed. And the way that they embraced what would have been, I wouldn't say tragedy, but disaster. I mean, the monsoon. I thought I knew what rain was, but the monsoon was so incredible. And instead of fighting against it and trying to wear raincoats and umbrellas and things like that, the people I knew in Shantiniketan just said, okay, we're going to go out in the rain. And so you simply walked, where if you went to a friend's house for dinner, you simply walked through the monsoon, getting completely and utterly sopping wet. When you got there, you were met at the door and whooshed off quickly to a room with other women in it. You stripped, you were given something new and dry to put on, and you went to dinner. It was not you weren't going to fight the monsoon. You simply embraced it, and it was thrilling. And there you were out there. So there was an acceptance of the heat and ways. I remember being so impressed in one of the Agra monuments, where in a palace, perhaps it was Udaipur in Rajasthan, where everything's marble and inlaid and all these precious things, But the most precious thing of all was cold water. And you had these intricate mechanisms, dripped cold water with a fan behind it over a work of marble. And you thought, never mind the elephants, never mind the dancing girls, never mind the emeralds the size of peacock's eggs. You had cool water if you were a king, and you had a wind behind it, and that alone was made into a luxury more precious than silk or jewels and so forth. And that was another way of using the extreme of the climate to make life beautiful, rather than fighting against it and saying, I really want to move to Alaska as soon as I can. I can't stand this heat anymore. So that was something a lesson, a life lesson that I learned from India, I would say.
Wendy, we're sort of coming towards the end of our program, but something that you mentioned earlier is that people in Bengal and beyond would be quite impressed when they learned that you know Sanskrit so fluently, and when you read from Sanskrit. What is evinced from your letters is there something else that really impressed them and struck them dumb, so to speak, as that is when you were singing Robindra Sangit. That's there in your letters, right? And
I posted to my parents. What do you write to your parents? You say, everyone here loves me. Everyone thinks I'm wonderful. I mean, I blush now to read those sections of the letters, but I did at one point say that everyone said that I sang Tagore Sangit very well.
Indeed. And so maybe what we could do is request not just Wendy, but Dipeshda as well. And Dipeshda, you and I were talking about this, right? I mean, if you think of Wendy's experience, right, that joyous discovery, that serendipity, it's epitomized in one very popular Tagore song, Akash Bhora.
Mind you, I was a soprano then. I'm a baritone now, but I'm willing. If you're willing to pay, I'm willing. Shall we try it?
Yes, I'll sing along with you.
But can you do that on Zoom? I mean, can you hear us both at once?
Well, that's the thing. Wouldn't you get an echo? I mean, wouldn't be sort of feeding into each other?
I don't think so. Go for it.
Okay.
Okay. So
Akash Bhora Shurjatara
Vishwabhara Pran Tahari Majkhane Ami Pechi Ami Pechi Mor Sthan Bishoy Tai Jage Jage Amar Pran
Akash Bhora
Ashim Kale Jehillore জোয়ার ভাটায় ভুবন দোলে অসীম কালের যে হিল্লোলে জোয়ার ভাটায় ভুবন দোলে নাড়িতে মোর রক্ত ধারায় লেগেছে তার টান বিস্ময়ে তাই জাগে জাগে আমার প্রাণ আকাশ ভরা
Wonderful.
You know the lyrics. I just know the first verse. It's a great song, and it's every word of it is true.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful song.
So, Wendy, we've got a couple of questions that we'd like to from our live audience, from the viewers, that we'll put up on screen, and maybe we can start with Rochana's question, please.
So it says, shall I read it?
Yes, it'll be great. All right.
I think Wendy dog wants to have a say.
Yes.
I think he was okay until Akash Bhora, then that was just too So Roger says it would be great to hear from Professor Doniger about the experience of traveling alone through India as a single young woman. What was your sense of gender relations from what you saw? It's a good question. And I wonder whether what happened then would be what happened now. It was young. I was young. I was 22. India was young, newly released from the colonial yoke. And people were very helpful to strangers. So when they saw that I wasn't Indian, I had to be careful. I was put at the front of the line usually. I said, no, 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 I can't do that. People stood aside. People helped me in and out. Well, once I had to crawl through the window of a third-class carriage, but wherever I was, men were gentlemen. People were nice. And they were particularly nice because I was a visitor. And there was a feeling of wanting to make me happy there and make me see the best of it. So I felt safe. Sometimes, every once in a while, this is some stuff I did not tell my parents. When I took a taxi, for instance, no one ever had an empty car in India because petrol was so expensive. So everyone always brought their family along with them. So if you took a taxi, if you hired a car to take you outside of Calcutta to the countryside to see a temple or something, people were in the car besides the driver. On one occasion, I went at night in a taxi which was driven by a Sikh driver, these big guys, and again, the big Sikhs. And I was driven miles into the Bengal countryside, and I did what I did there, and I felt entirely safe. And I remember I had a flicker of thinking, is this, I can't imagine doing that in Chicago. I just can't imagine it. But it was just okay there. And I knew it was. So I don't know how I would feel in India today. Well, individually, I think I don't know how I would feel in India. I've been in India for 10 years. But I'm an old lady now, so that it would be a different relationship. But I was a young girl, and I was treated very well indeed, in a kind of a courtly and gentlemanly manner by the men that I met in India. I was never shouted at or threatened in any way. And I think that may be a day that is long past now. But it was like that for me in India in 1963.
Yes, perhaps times have changed. We'll take up Chandok's question next. So this is more, yes.
What is your opinion about Rabindranath's system of alternative education that you found in Shantiniketan? I thought it worked well. What was it? It was an immersion in the arts, and in particular in the arts of Tagore, his poetry, his painting, his plays, and his philosophy, and music, a great deal of singing and music. It was an education of privilege in many ways. The problem was that it was very Tagorean, that it had the imprint of a single personality, a very powerful personality. And to have what became Vishwa Bharati, what became a university, what became much more than a girl's finishing school, after all, and to still have it in the shadow of this one particular man's idea, as there were cases in England also where there was a person who started a new kind of a school and everything was done his way, the Morris schools and so forth. I think it ceased to work well when India grew different and there was a need to know more things than music and painting as part of an education. So for me, it was lovely because it was sort of icing on the cake. I'd learned math and physics in school and so forth, and I was quite pleased to spend a year or just even part of a year learning poetry and music and so forth. But as a total view of education, I felt even then that it was too narrow to be of general use. It was an idol. It was a magical ashram off in the middle of a beautiful countryside. It wasn't part of real life, which is what made it wonderful, but also ultimately, I think, made it inadequate, and it had to change in order to survive as an Indian university. So that's what I thought. But I love Tagore. I still love Tagore. I love his poetry, and I love his music.
Wonderful. Wendy, we've just gone over the hour. So I was wondering, maybe Gary, Dipeshda, if you have any final sort of questions or observations, and then we can conclude.
I have a question. Am I muted or no? I'm not.
No, no, no.
No,
No.
We can hear you.
No, no, I was just. Well, the question is this, Wendy, that you've been involved with Indian studies almost all your adult life,
adolescent,
and
even my
from
adolescent.
adolescent life. Okay, so that's even longer. And I have lived in countries other than India, and now I've lived most of my life outside of India. But I've only studied a place that I've grown up in. So I don't know what it feels like. And this is the question to Gary as well, to study deeply another place that you haven't grown up in. I was explaining to somebody the other day, I said, what I loved about my life in America, after I came from Australia to America, was that American universities didn't require it of me that I learned about America.
Yeah.
If I worked on 14th century India, I worked on 14th century India, and that's it. So I know that America allows you that, but after all, you're a human being, and you've spent most of your life knowing about another place, another language, another set of stories, legends, everything. And I can imagine how that's tremendously enriching. But I only know what's enriching about my involvement with the place I was born and grew up in. Do you see what I'm saying? So I've only deepened my experiences, my lived experiences intellectually, whereas you have. So what's the relationship between your life and knowing about India?
So it's a good question. A lot of the letters deal with my feeling as an American in India at that time already, saying, I want to love everything here, and there are some things I can't love. And what do I do about feeling how I feel and at the same time trying to feel as they
Right.
feel? The Indians told me that all the beggars really purposely crippled all the children that weren't really crippled children. You don't have to give any money to beggars, and my Indian friends never did. And I reacted to a crippled child the way I would react to a crippled child. So I was always torn with wanting to like everything and not being able to. And I felt inadequate if I didn't like everything that I wanted to love everything in India, and I couldn't. And I remember thinking in Indian poetry, in Sanskrit poetry, when a very beautiful woman walks, she's said to walk like a female elephant. And actually, if you hang out with elephants, elephants are actually quite graceful. And that's what men, but they're big and fat. And to an American, saying that a woman is like a female elephant is just not pretty. A gazelle, yes. Indians say that a woman is like a gazelle. I can deal with the gazelle. So how do you deal with your head when you're reading a Sanskrit poem and saying she was so lovely, she walked like a female elephant? So even in India, I was dealing with this wanting to feel Indian in ways I couldn't, and hanging on to my trying to get rid of my American reactions, and of course, being unable to do it. There's a little bit in that letter where I said, I like the things here that I like everywhere. I like children, I like trees, I like landscapes. So that's what I could stay with. And then I had more trouble dealing with the sadhus who had sticks through their cheeks.
Right. Yeah.
So when I came back to America, I found that there were ways that I felt differently ever after because of having lived in India and of going on living in India, in the sense that really liking Indian painting better than Renaissance painting, and really liking Indian music. I wouldn't say better than, but it's sort of a big part of my life. And that I had the advantage of you, I guess, Dipation, that I ended up at home.
Right.
You ended up abroad.
Right.
And
No, the reason why I asked was, Wendy, when I lived in Australia, I lived there for 20 years, did my PhD there. I kind of felt that the first 5 or 6 years were all about Australia being not India.
yeah.
And one day, I remember I woke up and I was very angry about something in Australia. And I said to myself, now I belong, because
That's
this place
You're reacting
gets
like
me
an
angry.
Australian, yes.
Right. And that's what, yeah.
So you get to that. But I don't think I could get that deep in India in a year. I think that does
Sure.
take longer. And there are things about India that I've never really been able to like and to appreciate. There are aspects of the Indian social system that I don't like, but then of course there are aspects of the American social system that I hate even more. So it's not a contest here about who can be meaner to the people.
No. Yeah,
You
of
know, you
course
just
not.
hate it whenever you see it.
Mm.
But I did find that I could keep India in my American life in many wonderful ways, partly by having Indian friends, partly by keeping in touch with my friends in India. Until 2010, I went back to India quite often and renewed those friendships. I have an Indian publisher whom I love dearly, and a lot of my life is the writing of books. And Ravi Singh is a big part of my writing of books, and therefore India is always a part of my thinking of how to be a writer and how to publish books. Um, and I found basically that I was able to keep alive in my social life and in my artistic life, as well as obviously my scholarly life, a lot of things that I learned to love in India, which I had always disliked. I still like to eat with my hands. I still like to eat with my hands, even when I'm eating spaghetti. I mean, there are things that the Indians do better, I think. Um, and um, and I've kept, well, there I am, you know, in my show from my show from Ramanujan. Um, so I felt that it was always a part of some of the best parts of my life, that I took it back. And that part of that, what made it possible was being able finally to admit to myself when I was there in that year that I couldn't give up some ways of being an American, and that there were some things about Indian that would always be foreign to me, and that was all right. That was okay. And that it made it possible to embrace the many, many things which have continued to be such an important part of my life. So
And I
that's
think it's important that there have been many things. That's true for Dipesh too. I think Dipesh, I think you sell yourself a little short when you talk about the places you've lived. That is, if talking about places that you're at home in is not purely geographical. I mean, just look at your educational histories, your degrees. You started out in science, and then political things, and then history along the way. Or actually, before any of that, you were a playback singer in Bengali cinema. So there's always been a lot going on there, and the same for Wendy. I mean, my own engagement with India, like Wendy, was very important and had lasting impact. That I was able to go to India, but my focus has been narrower than Wendy's. I mean, I've focused on Kavya and Shastra and Panini and grammar, and what fascinated me about these things was their depth. That even in ancient texts, they were so sophisticated in talking about cognitive science and philosophy of language. But that's a scholastic focus is narrower than a scholarly focus. And my engagement with Sanskrit has been narrower than Wendy's. So when
that's
she talks
Gary
about,
knows everything about India. Gary knows absolutely everything about India. That's simply not
well,
true.
what I'm what I mean, Wendy, is that when you talk about making lasting friendships in India, I think one of your most important lasting friendships was your chance to solidify your friendship with the Puranas
Yes.
and those types of Sanskrit literature, which
Yeah.
with a lot of help from Professor Hauser and people like that. But you know, that's an area that makes your work broader and something that engages with a larger slice of life
Well,
in the things that I've been interested in. So you know, there's a choice between depth and breadth, and you've done a remarkable job of combining them.
well, the Puranas, of course, are like the equivalent of pulp fiction. And I remember Dan Ingalls was so appalled when I told him I wanted to. It's as if you were a scholar of Bach and you ended up and you said, "Well, I really like rap music better." Right? I'm actually shocked that I
No,
was
remember
Puranas
what
instead of Kalidasa.
the
But it is,
comparison he made was between Mozart and Elvis Presley.
that's right. In his day, that was what it
So,
was.
you know, the reason why I ask this question sometimes, because sometimes I'm at the University of Chicago, and I'm so lucky to be at the University of Chicago, and so lucky to be, you know, with all my colleagues, with Gary and Thibault and everybody in the department, Sasha and everybody. And these are all people that who are actually have given their lives to studying different aspects of the place that I come from,
Mhm.
and I learned from that. But also from what both of you have said, I think there's something that enriches life, and it's not always through a sweet sort of honey making process. Sometimes it includes sort of being hurt by another culture, or being misunderstood in another culture, all of those things. And sometimes I wonder if we communicate enough of that in what we teach our students. Sometimes the graduate school is so professionalized,
Yeah,
and maybe we do it to the undergraduate students more
yeah.
than
When I
to.
first came here, it wasn't so professional, and I was lucky enough to have students before I had any reputation. I wasn't even attracting students, I was just teaching, but Chicago had a reputation. And I had wonderful students who came and were just so ready to love India. My first, Laurie Patton and Arsha Sutter and Paula Richmond. They went on to do wonderful things because they really they wanted to love the culture and to find things in it like that. And Chicago has been such a place for such a long time, and I hope it continues under the new pressures of a very different professionalized way of being an academic. But in those glory days, we just sat around talking all day long about the books we'd read and the places we'd been. Students and teachers together. It was a grand time, and I was there's my serendipity, which carried me through India. It carried me through my years at the University of Chicago too.
That's true.
Wendy, we've gone over the hour.
I'm afraid we have. Sorry.
And what I'm thinking is, Dipesh, that maybe once her new book, it's already released in America, but by end of May, Winged Stallions and Wicked Mares is going to be out in stores in India. And maybe at that point of time, we can always get her back and do another special
that'd be lovely.
show. With
I would be delighted.
That would be wonderful.
I would be delighted for a return performance.
And I'm sure that's something that our viewers will be looking forward to with great pleasure and anticipation. But
this
for
was
now, yes. So we'll
thank you, Wendy and Gary, for coming on our program.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Dipesh, so much for making this
Thank you for putting this
eventful.
Putting up with the dog and everything. Sorry about that.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Stay well.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Good night.